If one of our supply chains or one of another country's supply chains that we rely on collapse, it could cause an unprecedented economic super collapse on a global scale. And that's how we could end up with this $85 trillion economic super collapse I'm predicting. $85 trillion being the value of the global economy. Because remember, our current supply chain is interconnected on a global scale. And if there is a single point of failure, the whole system is going to come collapsing down. Farming, banking, healthcare, oil and gas, tech, and so on. This isn't the first time I've warned Americans about this before. On May 11, 2020, I told my followers, the economy will not return to normal for years. There are serious constraints on supply. I issued another warning about my research on November 24, 2021. The supply chain difficulties will certainly grow worse. The remedies will take years and sometimes decades to implement. And yet another in 2022. Don't believe the happy talk about a temporary supply chain crisis. I'll say that again. The crisis will last for years with predictable negative effects on economic growth. But now things are even worse than ever before. And I fear this economic super collapse could hit American soil in the next 6 to 12 months. So this may be my last and final warning before it's too late. It's why I'm warning people around me it's only a matter of time before the world economy comes crashing down. Because when you talk about risk of catastrophic collapse, the risk increases with the size of scale. Look, whether you decide to listen to me today about how to prepare, whether or not you decide to get access to the information in this envelope, that's up to you. It's a free country. You can do what you want. You can even pretend you never heard me tell you any of this. But just know, Joe Biden certainly isn't going to come to your rescue. Take a look at this 9-second clip from the president.
When do you think things will get back to normal?
When do I think things will get back to normal? But my hope is by this time next year, we're going to be back to normal.
That clip was taken over 18 months ago. It's up to you what you believe, but I can't bury my head in the sand and ignore all the facts, and the facts couldn't be more clear. So in just a moment, I'm going to explain how you can get access to this information inside the envelope as part of my super collapse preparation package. And I'm going to talk about what to do to protect and even grow your wealth. Look, please understand, it brings me no joy to say this, and I hope the worst of what I'm warning of never comes to pass. But there's only one potential solution to this crisis, and it's going to take years. Recently, I spoke to a very well-informed CEO of a major corporation, and I asked him point blank, I said, your company must be looking ahead at some possible solution. Is there anything you can share? Well, I'm going to tell you the same thing he told me. He said, Jim, you have to understand that it took us 30 years to build these supply chains. We blew it up in 3 years, beginning in 2018, and you can't put it back together. But there is one thing we can do. It's not a quick fix, but it's our best and most sensible option. Our only way out is to build a new supply chain that eliminates the bad actors. We can't continue to allow our enemies like China or Russia or Iran to threaten consumers here on American soil. As the Wall Street Journal wrote, Russia's lengthening war with Ukraine will lead to a near doubling of inflation rates in rich countries. It's why the New York Times wrote, this is what happens when globalization breaks down. And why Barron's wrote, secure U.S. supply chains with allies and move out of China. Unfortunately, this solution could take years or even a decade to fully implement. And that CEO told me it will take at least 10 years to reconstruct the supply chains if we don't want to do it with China and globalization. But whether you realize it or not, that's the bet we're making as a nation. It's happening now. And when the dust settles, we're either going to have rolled out this new supply chain before a worst case scenario happens, or we're going to face whatever lies ahead from this $85 trillion economic super collapse. Now maybe you're wondering how bad things could really get. Let me answer that question with another question. Do you remember your life at the beginning of the pandemic? Despite all of our freedoms we all hold so dear, an unelected official with the ear of the president recommended immediate lockdowns, and suddenly we heard demands like shelter in place or stay at home, backed up by the threat of arrest. Large swaths of the economy ground to a halt. Looting took over our towns and cities. Because so many businesses were shut down, people were emboldened to take to the streets. But if most Americans don't have access to enough food, water, or other necessary supplies, do you really believe our streets and our businesses won't see more violence? It's why gun sales keep hitting all-time highs as more and more Americans prepare for whatever lies ahead. And while I hope the worst of what I'm warning in my urgent new book never comes to pass, I don't suggest you rely on hope to protect yourself and your family. I'm certainly not. Here's how I'm ensuring my family's well-being. First, I would suggest stocking up on essentials, just like I've done. I have a fully finished area in the basement of one of my properties. the address of which I keep totally private. It provides me with a warehousing area for months' worth of canned foods and other non-perishable provisions. That's important. Don't stop with a 3-day supply like the CDC recommends. Make sure you have enough water, basic food, and toiletries to last at least 3 months. And keep them in a safe area where they can sit without damage or spoiling. I would also recommend buying several large capacity freezers. I already have 3 and I may continue purchasing more. If you have the means, consider installing alternate energy solutions in case of a worst case scenario. I've already installed the largest non-commercial solar power system in New England on my property. If you can, have alternative sources of power generation on your property. I've also dug 3 wells, planted abundant gardens, and built a significant greenhouse. But whatever you decide, do recognize that none of it will matter if you're not getting accurate information about what to expect in the coming days. Like I said, to be able to make the right decisions during a crisis, you need to lean on someone. So if that's not me, you should find another well-connected person you can trust, ideally someone who's previously held a position of power in our government. But if you want to learn what's inside this envelope and see what I know, right now is your chance. See, I've gone ahead and published this information I'm holding here in this envelope inside my newest book. It has brand new proof of the unfolding situation and inside level details on how it will play out. Urgent Preparation Report number 1. Buy this asset after securing your family's food and energy. As the economy collapses and the shelves are bare, the government will respond by printing even more money. When it does, the value of the dollar will be destroyed through inflation. But 5,000 years of history proves that one item, gold, outlasts every other currency as a form of money. And I believe that economic collapse occurring right now will send gold skyrocketing over the next 6 months. That's why I'll send you my urgent report called The Perfect Physical Gold Portfolio. Everything you need to know about buying the right kind of physical gold. As part of my Super Collapse preparation package, you'll find everything you need to know about investing in gold before the price blasts through the ceiling, including, is gold safe to invest in? How much should I invest in precious metals? What metals should I buy and what should I avoid? What are the best places to buy gold and other precious metals? What are the safest ways to store gold to avoid theft or government confiscation? And much more. Plus, I'll also send you Urgent Preparation Report number 2, my Biden Bucks Protection Plan. I haven't mentioned it yet, but during my research, I came across a troubling executive order that President Biden just signed. See, every time there's an economic crisis, the government responds with massive new programs to try and control the economy and its citizens. In 2008, it was bailouts of big banks and new government agencies to regulate the financial industry. This time, it will be much worse. I've uncovered a plan for U.S. government cryptocurrency I call Biden Bucks that I believe the government will unveil during this economic collapse to control your money and manage the societal fallout. By the time this program is announced, it will be nearly impossible for everyday Americans like you to protect their wealth and keep their privacy, which is why I've created another urgent report to get you prepared ahead of time. Inside this new report, you'll get step-by-step details on what these Biden Bucks are, why they'll be used during this collapse, and how to outsmart this sinister program by creating 1, an off-the-grid fortune. Secure $1.1 million in wealth inside a soda can safe. 2, saving your freedoms. Have liquidity and spendable wealth without using Biden Bucks. And 3, growing your personal wealth. You'll get possible investment upside as events unfold. And 4, ensuring you maintain your wealth regardless of external conditions. Building your own off-the-grid portfolio now will protect you from the government surveillance state coming during the economic super collapse. Biden Bucks testing is underway. The digital dollar could be rolled out soon. Before it's too late, make sure to protect yourself and your retirement savings. You'll find everything you need in this urgent report as part of my Super Collapse preparation package. But that's not all, because you'll also get Urgent Preparation Report number 3. Secure this secret off-the-grid asset. You see, I've learned of another little appreciated asset that's a liquid form of wealth. It can't be tracked or traced. It's completely legal and easy to find if you know where to look. Over time, its value has steadily grown, but very few people know anything about its investment potential. You're about to be one of the few. I believe you must include this secret asset in any off-the-grid portfolio. disinflation, definitionally, but maybe even deflation is the opposite, at least for the time being. Inflation is the end game. It has to be, because there's no way out from under the debt. But right now, and people are still worried about inflation. Prices are still going up. I put gas in my car just like everyone else, so I'm well aware of it, eggs, bacon, et cetera. But inflation has been coming down steadily since June of 2022. So about 7 months in a row, 8 months in a row. It peaked then. We all know what gas prices were doing and so forth. But the reason is kind of interesting. And inflation, nominally, prices are going up. Okay, so that's inflation. But it can come from two sources that are opposite. One is from supply side shocks, supply chain disruption. We saw that in 1973 with the Arab oil embargo over the Arab-Israeli war at the time. The price of oil quadrupled, et cetera. That was a supply shock. The thing about supply side inflation is it's self-negating. It burns itself out. So, the old saying, and it's true, the cure for high oil prices is high oil prices. In other words, when things get too expensive because of supply disruption, people can't afford them, businesses close, you get layoffs, you go into recession, and prices come down pretty quickly after that. The other source of inflation is from the demand side, and this is a completely different dynamic. We saw this in the late 70s, where prices are going up, but people have some bargaining power, so unions are on strike, they're getting higher wages. I worked at Citibank in the late 70s, early 80s. They used to give us raises without asking. They just say, here's another $20,000, because they knew that the cost of living was going up and we would all change jobs if they didn't pay us more. So, but that feeds on itself. So the supply side disruption tends to snuff itself out. The demand side inflation tends to feed on itself. It gets out of control. And then we saw what Paul Volcker did with interest rates in 1981, where he took them to 20%. He caused a recession in terms of tight monetary policy to snuff out the inflation. But otherwise, if you don't do that, that just runs away. Now, the inflation we saw in 2022, late 2021, 2022, it was real. It wasn't transitory the way Jay Powell said. And the price of gasoline doubled, more than doubled, and all the other complaints you hear. The filling up your Ford F-150 pickup truck went from $70 to $140, which for a lot of people that meant they couldn't eat or couldn't go out. It was killing demand in entertainment, shopping, retail, a lot of other things, which again tends to snuff it out. So that has happened to a great extent. Starting in June 2022, that was the peak, and this inflation has been coming down. Now, it's still too high. The Fed's not done. We're going to see at least one more interest rate hike, maybe, but they're going to leave one more on the table. We'll see what happens in June. I'm not forecasting June, but I would not rule out another interest rate hike in June after the May hike. So, because Jay Powell's thinking, how many times do I have to say this? He's given 9 speeches since August 2022, August 26th at the Jackson Hole, then September FOMC meeting, November FOMC meeting, end of November, a speech at the Brookings Institution, December FOMC, congressional testimony, et cetera. And every time he said the same thing. Inflation is job one. We've got to get unemployment up. Believe it or not, we're going to have a recession and unemployment's going to go up. Sorry about that, but we've got to get inflation under control. And until we do, what's under control mean? Well, it's 2%. That's their goal. Well, it's come down from 9 to 5. Nice job, but 5's still a far cry from 2, and it gets harder as you go along. And they're searching for what they call the terminal rate. So the terminal rate, no one knows what the number is. I don't know because Jay Powell doesn't know, but the terminal rate, by definition, it's a rate that's high enough that it brings inflation down on its own without further rate hikes. Because so far, they've been raising rates and inflation's been coming down. Okay, that makes sense. And they can keep raising rates and it'll come down more. But is there a level where, we're there, now we can sit tight, the famous pause, and inflation will keep coming down? Now, you don't know because it's not a controlled experiment. You can't do it twice. But they're getting close. So whether it's 5.25, 5.5 remains to be seen. But that's the terminal rate. But then Wall Street came up with this narrative. Oh yeah, as soon as they're done hiking rates, they're going to cut them. This is the famous pivot we've been hearing about for over a year at this point. No, as far as they're concerned, forget rate cuts in 2023. Maybe mid-2024, we'll get back to you on that. But there's one wild card in the deck, which is that's the Fed's plan. So I just gave you the Fed's game plan. It's not, you don't need a crystal ball. They tell you what they're going to do. All you have to do is listen, although a lot of people don't. Wall Street makes up their own version of that. But the idea of rate cuts following hitting the terminal rate is, well, rate cuts go down, so dividends look higher, so buy stocks. Wall Street is always buy stocks. That's always the punchline. But they might cut rates late in the year, not because it's their plan, not because they want to, but we could be in a very severe recession. And that, at which point, because the Fed's always late, they're always following the market. They never lead the market. Mm-hmm. If they've already raised it, let's say they may already be at the terminal rate, not know it. And so if they keep raising, which I expect they will, they may throw this economy into a very severe recession, at which point they may have to cut rates, not because it's in the playbook, but because unemployment goes up to 7%. And but that gets back to the first question, Constantine, which is what's next. Disinflation may be deflation. The answer is diversification. Everyone goes, oh, we know that, diversification. But they know the term, but they actually don't know what diversification is. And I'll give you an example. I run into people all the time. They go, well, Jim, I'm fully diversified. I have 50 stocks in 10 different sectors: telecommunications, semiconductors, consumer non-durables, metals and mining. And I go, you're not diversified. You may have 50 stocks, but you're in one asset class called stocks or equities. And they're all going to go up together, or they're all going to go down together. And the more stressful the condition, the more reason you have to be concerned about it, the higher the correlation. On any given day, some stocks go up and stocks go down. But when you dial the stress meter up, they all tend to move together. So I don't care about your 50 stocks, your 10 sectors, that's not diversified. So what does real diversification look like? Have a sleeve of equities if you want, that's fine. I would say I look hard at oil, natural gas, natural resources, agriculture. Again, kind of equities that have hard assets behind them that will do well in inflationary times or even in recessionary times, because you need all those things no matter what. Then a slice of real estate. I wouldn't be in commercial real estate, but residential real estate, income producing real estate, farms, etc. That's good. I have a big slug of cash. And people go, well, cash doesn't have any yield. Well, lately the yields, you can get 2-3%, on like a CD. But even in a simple savings account, it is quite low. It's kind of less than 1%. But people don't understand the value of cash in a couple of respects. Number one, in a deflationary environment, we're not there yet, but we could hit that if the recession gets bad enough. Cash could be your best performing asset. It doesn't go up in nominal terms, but it goes up in real terms. If you have 2% deflation, your cash is worth 2% more in terms of purchasing power. But the real value of cash is optionality. And this is not well understood. I shared an office with Myron Scholes for 6 years, so I see options under the pillow, so to speak. But if you're the one with cash, when things, first of all, it'll definitely preserve wealth. So if things are falling all around you, your cash will be what it's worth, unless you're in Silicon Valley Bank. It's a separate issue. But although they got bailed out. But so it'll preserve wealth, even if it's not a high performer. It'll do very well in deflation. But the real benefit is when everything else is falling apart, you're the one who can go shopping. So it's kind of an at-the-money call option on every asset class in the world. Everyone's selling everything in a panic. You can bide your time, watch it go down, look for a bottom, and then say, okay, now I'll buy these things down 30% or 40% or 50% from where they were. Some alternatives. I have a number of investments in private equity and venture type situations, and they're risky and they're not liquid. But some of them will do very well. Some of them have done well, so that's nice. And then a slice of gold. And I recommend 10%. Because people, they put words in your mouth. They go, Jim Rickards says, sell everything and buy gold. I've never said that. Not a good strategy. But 10%, yeah. People hear the government say, the economy's fine, or, unemployment's near an all-time low, which actually statistically is true. And they kind of nod and go, yeah, it's all good. And then reality is the stuff that hits you in the head like a 2x4. The propaganda is positive. We can talk about that in a little more detail. The reality is harsh, and reality wins. There's a very good book on this by Robert Shiller, Nobel Prize winning economist at Yale University. I'm not a huge fan of your garden variety PhD economists, but there are some good ones out there, and he's one of them. He wrote a book about, 2 years ago, maybe a little bit less, called Narrative Economics. He said, we got all the models and Phillips curve and wealth effect and various, quantity theory of money, and, some have a place, some are more valuable than others. But don't underestimate the power of a narrative. A narrative is a story. It's basically it's a fancy name for a story, but a story that persists, that grows. And interestingly, in epidemiology, of course, we've just come through a pandemic. There's a model called the SEIR model that stands for susceptible. Are you susceptible to a virus? E for exposed. Are you exposed to it? I, are you infected? Did you get it? And R, did you recover? The difference between I and R are people who died. But it's a model, and it's mathematically based, and it's empirically validated of how viruses spread exponentially. And you can also use it to forecast how a virus is going to go. Well, what Schiller did, he took that model, moved it over to economics, and took a narrative kind of like a virus, not in a negative sense, but just as something that spreads. And it can be very powerful, and then eventually may die out or reverse, but it can be powerful in the meantime. That much I knew, but what I learned from the book that I hadn't really thought about is that narratives don't have to be true. They can be true, and they can be very powerful, but a narrative can be false and still be powerful. If it's the self-fulfilling prophecy, if enough people believe it, it sort of becomes the reality to some extent, even if it's based on false premises. He gives an example during the Great Depression. The Great Depression really was two technical recessions, but there was a period from 1929 to 1933, election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Then there was another period from 1933 to 1937. The 37 and 1940 part we leave aside for this purpose. But during the first part of the Great Depression, unemployment was high, output was dropping, trade was dropping. It was a very, very bad time, no doubt about it. But not everybody was out of work. Not everybody was poor. There were a lot of people with a lot of money at the time. But it was felt that being ostentatious was poor form. It's like, okay, I'm lucky I have a job, I've got some money, but I'm not going to buy a new car, buy a big house, or flash it around or whatever, because it's really not considerate of all the people who actually have fallen on hard times. Well, that was the narrative, but it's the worst possible economic advice, because it's precisely the fact that people with the money should keep spending that kind of can boost the economy out of the depression. So by people saying, well, even though I have the money, I'm not going to spend it because it's poor form, we're actually prolonging the Great Depression. Now, when FDR came along, he was elected in 1933, became president in 1934, the psychology turned 180 degrees, and all of a sudden, the Democratic campaign song was "Happy Days Are Here Again," and FDR seemed to solve the banking crisis and so forth. And all of a sudden, it became okay to spend money. Well, in the middle of the Great Depression, 1934 to 1936, those were some of the strongest years ever for the stock market. And unemployment did come down a lot. Now, the problem is it came down from like 25% to 15%. Well, 15% is still, painfully high, but it was a big move in the right direction. So he describes how the narrative flipped from don't spend money, it's poor form, to, go spend money and help the economy. None of that is taught in business school. It's not taught in economics. It can be modeled using this epidemiology model, but it doesn't fit into any of the standard macroeconomic models, but it's powerful stuff. And so today what's going on is that the White House is trying to push a narrative, and they're failing badly. But they'll say, if you listen to deliberations among White House officials, some of the stuff leaks to the press, and I know some of these people, it's like the economy's great, unemployment's really low. We've created all these jobs since the pandemic, but we're doing a really bad job of messaging. The point is, they're inside the White House, they're frustrated that the positive economic story is not getting out. The correct analysis is that there is no positive economic story. The economy is in terrible shape. The problem is not the messaging, it's the message. And this is where I say the propaganda from the White House that things are great is at odds with the reality, which is things are not great. Let me give you some specific data points, because as I say, I don't like to make statements like this without backing it up. Number one, the inflation was going up long before the war in Ukraine started. So if everything was great until February 27th, and then Russia invades, and then all of a sudden the inflation goes up. All right, let's talk about it. But that's not true. This inflation goes back to late 2021. It was persistent in the fall. We all remember the Fed and the Treasury saying transitory, transitory, transitory. And then finally, I think Jay Powell was testifying before Congress. He said, it's time to retire the word transitory. So that was his way of throwing in the towel. And Janet Yellen admitted she was mistaken also. So it predates the war, number one. Number two, energy prices are going up because there's a war with Russia. Well, I wonder why that is. Well, the reason is not because Putin invaded Ukraine. It's because the U.S. counterattacked with financial sanctions. Now, bear in mind, go back to January 21st, 2021, when Biden was sworn in as president and then went back to the White House. What was the first thing he did? He closed the Keystone XL pipeline. This is a pipeline that would bring oil from Alberta, Canada, into the United States, where it would connect at a hub. I believe it's in Kansas, but somewhere in the central United States. And then the hub distributes it to the entire country. So he shut down that pipeline, which curtailed the supply of oil from Canada. Then ended new leasing, oil and gas exploration leasing of federal lands, handicapped the fracking industry, took a number of other steps using environmental tools, climate alarm, government subsidies, et cetera, to basically, to the extent possible, shut down the U.S. energy industry as much as possible. Now, you can't shut down completely, of course, but everything happens at the margin. And then we end up with oil prices doubling or tripling, really, from $40 to $120 in under a year, which is comparable to what happened in 1973 with the Arab oil embargo. And then Biden wakes up and says, guess we need more oil. And he wants to reopen leasing. I said they shut it down. They did, but he wants to reopen it. He's begging Saudi Arabia to pump more. Saudi Arabia is kind of not returning his phone calls. He's begging Venezuela to pump more. Oh, great. The greatest pariah dictator in the Western Hemisphere, and we're begging him for oil. So why don't we drill our own oil? Because we were a net exporter up until 2021, and then Biden came in and we lost that edge and became a net importer, including recently buying oil from Russia. They curtailed that for political reasons, but that's kind of where we got to. So you wonder why the price of energy is going up. In other words, this damage was self-inflicted, but don't be misled by the headlines because they're, again, this narrative, but they're not actually doing it. So the point being, the price increase and the inflation in the U.S. has very little to do with Putin and everything to do with the U.S. handicapping its own energy industry, begging dictators for oil, and the influence of the climate alarmists. And by the way, that whole crowd want higher gas prices. They want gas to be $7, $8, $9 a gallon because they expect that will accelerate the transfer to electric vehicles and make the electric vehicle more attractive relative to the internal combustion engine. Now, that's another fantasy. It won't happen. We don't have time to go through all the physics of it. Output of energy by weight, gasoline compared to batteries, and the pollution of batteries, and the fact that we don't have the charging stations. And even if we did, where's that electricity coming from? Oh, coal. It will never happen. But meanwhile, they're destroying the U.S. economy in pursuit of an ideological point that will never actually happen. Another example of propaganda versus reality. Narratives are powerful, but reality is more powerful. I'd rather be the U.S. than China. China's in even worse shape for different reasons. It's not so much interest rate policy, although they're subject to global interest rate policy and exchange rates coming from the Fed. But you can see it in real estate. It's a full-scale collapse. They're propping it up, but the buyers aren't interested. In other words, the Chinese government is telling the banks to lend money to real estate developers who can't finish housing. Well, that sounds good. It's like, okay, here's some money, finish the housing. But the buyers are not flocking in. The buyers have been burned. They're shying away from that asset class. They want to increase cash. They're looking at other asset classes. They don't have a lot of choices because China has very strict capital controls. They're trying to get their money out by means legal and illegal. They're buying gold when they can. But as I say, they may not have a lot of choices, but even money in the bank looks pretty good compared to what's going on in real estate. The problem is too big. The bubble is too large. It's going on for too long. We don't hear about it the same way we did about the Japanese real estate bubble in 1989, 1990. That was an epic crash. Japan is still not recovered. I remember in the 90s, early 2000s, they talked about the lost decade. Well, try 3 lost decades. That's going into a 4th. That's Japan, 8 or I've lost count, actually 8 or 9 recessions since 1989, but it's really just one long depression. That's the way to understand the Japanese economy. China's going into something like that. We don't hear much about it because they're not transparent. They lie about their numbers. You need to look at private sources and use other analytic tools to understand what's going on there. But they've got drops in consumption, industrial output, real estate's collapsing, their price indices are collapsing. All this fear of inflation. It's been around, it's real, but it's now turning around very quickly, and you can see that in China. China's going through something that the world has never seen. They're going to lose 600 million people in the next 50 to 70 years. This is a demographic implosion. This is worse than the Black Death. Of course, the Black Death killed somewhere between a third and half the population of Europe in the 14th century. It was a good time for labor, by the way. The labor was so scarce that returns to labor went up versus returns to capital because there weren't enough workers. But that's the only thing that can come close. Even the Spanish flu of 1919 killed about, no one's certain of the number, but between 100 million and maybe over 200 million people. The 30 Years' War was certainly, in the early 17th century, was certainly highly destructive. But what's going on in China now is worse than any of those things. It has to do with simple demographic math. The key number is 2.1. Two people have to produce 2.1 children. Man and woman, or you can say per woman if you want, have to produce 2.1 children to keep the population constant. Why not two? Why not two producing two? The answer is infant mortality and those who don't make it to adulthood and can continue the repopulation of the planet, if you will. But they're not even close to that. They're well below two. And by the way, so is the rest of the world. So is Australia and the US and Western Europe and a lot of other places. This is a global phenomenon, but it's particularly acute in China. It may be the case that China's replacement rate is or birth rate is actually 1. It has to be 2.1 to maintain. It could be 1 or lower. This is a demographic implosion unlike anything anyone's ever seen. It also has a dynamic. You can't reverse it very quickly. It feeds on itself, as I was talking about inflation earlier. So this is going to continue for 50 to 75 years. They're going to lose 600 million people. There are a lot of definitions of GDP, 4 or 5 part definition. There are more complex calculations, but there's one really simple definition. It only has 2 factors: population and productivity. How many people are working and how productive are they? That's nominal GDP. That's one definition of gross GDP or nominal GDP. Well, if your population is dropping from 1.4 billion to 800 million, you're losing 600 million people. And then what about productivity? Well, the other thing that's going on is China's population is aging very quickly. So you get a population set people in the 70s, 80s, and 90s with very large amounts of cognitive decline, dementia. Obviously, there's no productivity there, but it's worse than that because then you look at the shrinking population between the ages of 25 and 54. It's called that prime working age. More and more of those people are going to have to be involved in elder care. They're going to have to be basically caretakers or caregivers for the older population I described. A very worthy job, but not one that lends itself to productivity gains. Bathing hasn't changed in about 5,000 years. Robots don't do baths. The only real innovation in bathing in between 1870 and 1940, we did see the rise of indoor plumbing and hot water. That's good. I enjoy both, but that's it. I can't think of any other bathing innovations in the last several millennia. So if you have a shrinking working age population, a rising older population, high degree of cognitive decline, and a big slice of the working age population having to provide elder care or be caregivers for the older population, tell me where your industrial output's coming from. Tell me where your productivity is coming from. And sorry if I mentioned this already, but 50% of the water in China is poisoned because of, just their industrial practices. If you're a gold miner in Australia, I've invested in gold mines around the world. I know that places like Canada, the US, and Australia, if you use cyanide to leach the gold, and that's a very common technique, you have to account for every microgram. Whatever you put in, you got to take out, weigh it, dispose of it properly. In China, they just dump it into the rivers, and so the rivers are poisoned. So China is an economic, demographic, industrial, moral, religious wasteland, and will suffer. It's already in a recession. Just to cut to the chase, again, they lie about their statistics. So here you have the two largest economies in the world, U.S. and China. U.S. is slowly going into what I expect will be a severe recession. China is in a century-long decline, unlike one that the world has ever seen. That could eventually lead to social unrest and a regime change, but let's not count on that in the short run. Just expect China to shrink and become more autarkic, decoupled from the Western world, and certainly not be a source of growth. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, the largest and most sophisticated semiconductor manufacturing in the world. And semiconductors are in everything. It's not just computers. There are 1,400 semiconductors in an automobile. There's a semiconductor or more in your dishwasher, your refrigerator, your washing machine. They're everywhere. Internet of Things. We all understand that. So TSMC, based in Taiwan. The United States has a military doctrine called the broken nest theory. And what it says is that if China, well, it comes from a Chinese proverb, ironically, and it says, if the nest is broken, how can the eggs survive? And what it means is that if China invades Taiwan, and I'm not forecasting an invasion, could happen though, we or the Taiwanese will very quickly destroy all the semiconductor manufacturers in Taiwan. We'll just blow them up. And China won't get anything. They'll have the broken nest. Taiwan Semiconductor knows this. They talk to the U.S. intelligence and military. We're in a recession. I mean, it's not coming. We're in it. It's a triple, greatest bubble of all time, times three, in the sense that it's real estate, stocks, and other asset classes. The largest, most sophisticated, biggest player, real money market in the world is telling you that the Fed's going to blink, that they're going to raise rates, but then things are going to get so bad, they're going to have to cut rates. And that's why we can see a liquidity crisis and a very severe recession coming well in advance. I haven't really seen the market collapse, stock market collapse that I would expect in association with a severe recession has not happened yet. This is going to play out. It'll get worse as the year goes on. Inflation was going up long before the war in Ukraine started. So if everything is great until February 27th, and then Russia invades, and then all of a sudden the inflation goes up. All right, let's talk about it. But that's not true. This inflation goes back to late 2021. It was persistent in the fall. We all remember the Fed and the Treasury saying transitory, 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 and then finally, I think Jay Powell was testifying before Congress. He said, it's time to retire the word transitory. So that was his way of throwing in the towel. And Janet Yellen admitted she was mistaken also. This is going to be part of what throws the economy into severe recession. They're raising rates and inflation's coming down. But what they don't know is, are interest rates coming down because they're raising rates, or have they already hit the terminal rate and it's coming down on its own and they just don't know it? And that's a big deal, because if they're at the terminal rate and they just don't know it and they keep tightening, which they are going to over tighten, probably already have. The energy prices are going up because there's a war with Russia. Well, I wonder why that is. Well, the reason is not because Putin invaded Ukraine, it's because the U.S. counterattacked with financial sanctions. Now, bear in mind, go back to January 21st, 2021, when Biden was sworn in as president, and then went back to the White House. What was the first thing he did? He closed the Keystone XL pipeline. This is a pipeline that would bring oil from Alberta, Canada, into the United States, where it would connect at a hub. I believe it's in Kansas, but somewhere in the central United States. And then the hub distributes it to the entire country. So he shut down that pipeline, which curtailed the supply of oil from Canada. And then we end up with oil prices doubling or tripling, really, from $40 to $120 in under a year. The other source of inflation is on the demand side. So you have what's called cost push inflation. That's where supply is choked off, or there's an embargo, or there's a shortage, natural disaster, a lot of things. It's coming from the supply side, and demand is inelastic, so you just pay up or kind of do without. But the demand side is much more psychological. That's called demand pull inflation. That's when consumers behave the way I described, and as I say, I lived through the 70s, where hey, I better buy it today, I better buy it now. You're pulling all this demand forward and bidding up prices because you're worried that it's going to get even worse. So inflation is coming down, no question. But is it because the Fed has continued to raise rates, or is it because the Fed has hit a terminal rate and all they have to do is nothing, just pause, as they put it, and inflation will come down where they want? The market believes we're at the terminal rate. The Fed should just stop right now, leave it alone. Sooner than later pivot to, that's the new buzzword, pivot to rate cuts. And it's the anticipation of those rate cuts that has Wall Street all spun up. They get the pom-poms out and saying, buy stocks, buy tech, because the Fed's going to cut rates. The Fed does not see it that way at all. The Fed says, yeah, we're raising rates, inflation's coming down, but we're not at the terminal rate. We'll kind of know when we see it, but they think it's probably 5.25. That's a very good estimate based on what the Fed has said themselves. I started my career in banking in 1976, and so I remember my wife and I used to kid each other. She was in advertising, I was in banking, and the inflation was so bad, you'd get a raise every like 4 or 5 months, and you didn't have to ask. They would just give it to you because they knew that you were going to quit if they didn't keep up. So she would get a raise, and she was making more than I was at the time. So we'd go out to dinner, and then I would get a raise, and I was making more than she was. So we would just tease each other about that. But that's how it was. And the psychology was, you know, if you needed whatever, you know, a TV set or refrigerator, new car, whatever, you say, I better buy it now because the price is going to be higher. If I wait a month or 2 months, the price is going to run away from me. So it had huge behavioral effects. Between 77 and 81, so that 5-year period, the dollar lost 50% of its purchasing power, not 15, 50. During the first part of the Great Depression, you know, unemployment was high, output was dropping, trade was dropping. It was a very, very bad time, no doubt about it. But not everybody was out of work. Not everybody was poor. There were a lot of people with a lot of money at the time, but it was felt that being ostentatious was poor form. It's like, you know, okay, I'm lucky I have a job, I've got some money, but I'm not going to buy a new car, buy a big house, or flash it around or whatever, because it's really not considerate of all the people who actually have fallen on hard times. Well, that was the narrative, but it's the worst possible economic advice, because it's precisely the fact that people with the money should keep spending that kind of can boost the economy out of a depression. So by people saying, well, even though I have the money, I'm not going to spend it because it's poor form, we're actually prolonging the Great Depression. Today, we are starting with the cost push inflation, mainly the price of energy, but the price of food is a big factor. And of course, they're related. You know, it's like, here's the energy, here's the food. You know, where do you think the food comes from? To get the food, you got to feed the pigs and cows. What do you feed them? You feed them corn. How do you get corn? Well, you grow it on a farm. You need nitrogen fertilizer. You need diesel in your tractors. You get the food, you got to put it in a truck to get it from point A to point B. That requires diesel. The higher the diesel price, the higher the cost of food because you're moving it by truck, etc. So these things, as I say, are linked. But food prices are going up substantially, and the two things you can't do without are gas in the car and food. So you have that cost push inflation. We're not quite at the stage where it's demand pull. We're not quite at the stage where individual consumers are behaving the way I described in the 1970s, saying, hey, better spend the money fast because it's losing value. This damage was self-inflicted, but don't be misled by the headlines because they're, again, this narrative, but they're not actually doing it. So the point being, the price increase and the inflation in the U.S. has very little to do with Putin and everything to do with the U.S. handicapping its own energy industry, begging dictators for oil, and the influence of the climate alarmists. And by the way, that whole crowd want higher gas prices. They want gas to be $7, $8, $9 a gallon because they expect that will accelerate the transfer to electric vehicles and make the electric vehicle more attractive relative to the internal combustion engine. Now, that's another fantasy. It will never happen. But meanwhile, they're destroying the U.S. economy in pursuit of an ideological point that will never actually happen. The supply chain was breaking down before COVID. Now, of course, COVID made it worse, yes. And the war in Ukraine made it worse yet, yes. But this really started with Trump's trade war in 2018. So that, like I said, there's a thread that runs through all these things. So not to throw out my hands, I'm not going to do that. But when you ask me that, I'm thinking, well, I'm talking about China, Ukraine, supply chain, Biden. They're all a big deal. If in terms of tragedy, probably the war in Ukraine is the most important because it's highly, highly significant economically and strategically. But of course, it's a human tragedy going with it. If Chinese real estate implodes, okay, there's some hardship here and there, but it's not like people being killed or maimed or forced into refugee status. And that is part of what's going on in Ukraine. So that's probably. I spent a lot of time on the Fed. The question is, okay, what about June? They got, 6 more meetings this year. So here's the Fed's dilemma, and it's playing out in real time. So Jay Powell gave, I lost count, 7 or 8 speeches, and they said the same thing every time. He said, inflation is job one. We're on a path to raise interest rates. We're not going to quit until inflation is under control. Now, there's a little wiggle room around that. Their target is 2. They actually look at personal consumption expenditure year over year, core. That's their metric. There are 15 ways to measure inflation, but that's the one they like. But even that is still over close to 5. It's a long way from 2. That's the point. You're trying to get to 2. They're a long way from 2. But there's something called the terminal rate. What's the terminal rate? Well, no one knows the number. I don't know because Jay Powell doesn't know. So we're all estimating. But the terminal rate, it's a rate that's high enough to bring down inflation on its own without further rate hikes. We can stop here and confident that inflation is going to come down without doing more. Because the conundrum is, okay, they've been raising rates since March 2022. Monetary policy works with a lag. Inflation peaked in July 2022, and it has been coming down ever since. Some months were, January was hot compared to December, but the trend has been down. So they're raising rates and inflation is coming down. So that's good. But here's what they don't know. Was inflation coming down because they were raising rates, or had they already hit the terminal rate and they just didn't know it? Because Wall Street was like, no, you've hit the terminal rate. Stop, please stop. You got this under control. The Fed doesn't believe that. One of the greatest blunders in monetary policy was Paul Volcker in 1980, who had started raising rates in 1979, and inflation was coming down. But then in 1980, we had a very sharp recession that had nothing to do with monetary policy. It wasn't caused by Paul Volcker. Jimmy Carter put a cap on credit card interest, and banks stopped issuing credit cards. So, well, that'll sink the economy. And then so Volcker reacted to that by lowering interest rates 7 percentage points, not 70 basis points, 7 percentage points, because we're in a recession, right? That's what Feds do. The Fed chairs do. But because it was a regulatory blunder, they fixed it and the economy came roaring back. And then inflation really took off, worse than when Volcker got in 79 and early 1980. So Volcker had to take rates to 20% to get inflation under control the second time after cutting them in 1980. And that's called the Volcker mistake or the Volcker blunder. And Volcker himself, I spoke to him, he said, yeah, that was a mistake, that I should have stuck to my program, not worried about the economy and unemployment, but just got inflation under control. But when he threw in the towel prematurely, the inflation went to the moon. Jay Powell doesn't want to be that guy. Jay Powell knows that episode as well as I do. And he doesn't want to be the guy who throws in the towel early and then inflation just goes to the moon and then he has to take interest rates to 15% or something ridiculous. So Wall Street's saying, you're already there, mission accomplished. Powell's saying, not so fast. They told Volcker that and he cut rates and it was an enormous mistake. So Powell's not going to be that guy. So what is the terminal rate today? I would say 5.5, because we had a lot of hot data, unemployment down, job creation up, retail sales up, not to the moon, but these are the opposite of what Powell is looking for. So he's had no confirmation that inflation is coming down on its own. He's had a lot of data that says inflation may be getting ready to take off again. So you got to say the terminal rate went from 5.25 to 5.5, maybe more. Let's see what he does in June. And Powell always said, I don't care if there's a recession. I don't care if there's unemployment, because the long-term costs of inflation are going to be much greater than those short-term problems. We got to suffer through that to get a bigger problem under control. He thinks of inflation. He said this many, many times. Now, along comes Silicon Valley Bank. Okay. Oh, by the way, in addition to raising rates, don't forget QT, quantitative tightening. They were shrinking their balance sheet. It's very hard to estimate the monetary impact of shrinking the balance sheet, but the best estimate is for every $1 trillion you take it down, it's probably equal to a 1 percentage point hike in the Fed funds rate. So the tightening has been more than just taking the Fed funds rate up. You also have to take into account QT. Now let's go back to the bond guarantee bailing out the entire banking system. The Fed proceeded to guarantee every deposit and every bank in the entire U.S. banking system. Here we're talking, $6 or $7 trillion of assets. And the way they did it was a lot of other banks, big ones and small ones, at least the big ones had good risk management, but a lot of small and medium-sized banks, they had the same problem Silicon Valley Bank had. Maybe the depositors weren't walking out the door, or maybe they weren't funding tech startups, but they had underwater bonds and overnight deposits and were facing the same thing. So the Fed said, okay, all you banks, if you send us your bonds, we'll give you cash. Okay, that's just a normal discount operation, but that will give you cash equivalent to the par value. So again, remember the market value is like 80 cents on the dollar, but the Fed says we'll give you 100 cents on the dollar. So now you ship your bonds to the Fed. They give you not 100%, which is like low collateral, but they give you 120%. So the banks are shipping in bonds that are worth 80 cents on the dollar. Why wouldn't you do that? I'm like, hey, Fed, if you want to give me a low interest rate bridge loan with 80% down, I'll take all you got. So now the banks are going to do that. And by the way, because it's structured kind of like a repurchase agreement, there's no sale. So they don't have to market to market. If you sold it to a third party, a dealer, you'd have to take the loss. But now they don't have to take the loss. So they're shipping in billions, potentially $1 trillion or more of these bonds. They're not getting 80, 90 cents on the dollar, which is what they're worth. They're getting 100 cents on the dollar, which was the original purchase price. They don't have to take the loss, and they're getting cash. Why wouldn't you do that all day long? So in effect, they bailed out the entire banking system to the tune of trillions of dollars. They just blew up the $250,000 limit. Forget that. I mean, I know what the statute says, but they threw that out the window. And the moral hazard, the economic consequences, the repercussions of this are kind of unimaginable. I mean, I can sketch them. I can talk about them. To hear Janet Yellen say it's not a bailout. Are you kidding me? This is the biggest bailout in history. And I negotiated the LTCM bailout. I lived through that. That was $1 trillion of derivatives. Through 2008, 2020, the pandemic, I go back to 1994, the Mexican tequila crisis. I've lived through all these and been more or less directly involved in all of them. And this is orders of magnitude greater in terms of what's being bailed out. Doesn't that mean that a lot of banks will be sending the bonds to the Fed and getting cash? Yeah, that's exactly what it means. Well, where's the cash come from? You got to print it. So on the one hand, we're doing quantitative tightening by letting bonds mature and not reinvesting. But on the other hand, you just send an open invitation, open party, house party to every bank in the country saying, send us your bonds and we'll give you cash. Not only that, but 100 cents on the dollar, even if they're worth 80. So you're going to have potentially trillions of dollars of new money being printed at a time when the Fed's trying to get inflation under control and they were trying to shrink the balance sheet. They're going to be expanding the balance sheet. So, I mean, there's no way out. There's no good way out of this. You can pause. I don't think they will, but you could pause and not raise rates, right? And implicitly saying we're not going to raise rates for the foreseeable future because we got all these losses in the banks. Okay, inflation goes to the moon. I promise you it'll just take off like a rocket. Or you can raise interest rates 25 basis points and we'll continue this war on inflation, but you're just going to increase the bond losses in the banks and make them send you more bonds and get more cash. Or the third thing is just take away the umbrella and let all these banks fail. I mean, it's like name your poison. Name your poison. You can have runaway inflation, severe acute banking crisis, or basically a lot more bank failures and a severe recession because you're going to keep raising rates. There are three choices, but none of them are good. Inflation is coming down, by the way. And having said that, the target is 2%. So he's not there, but he's making progress. Now, Wall Street's saying, you're done. You did it. Mission accomplished. Inflation is coming down. You got what you wanted. Give it time. Stop raising rates. You're going to kill the economy. But the Fed is saying, well, we actually don't know. We can't untangle it. Yes, inflation is coming down. That's objective. But is it coming down because we're still raising rates? Or is it coming down because we're at the terminal rate? Those are two different things. And right now, and this is what Powell's been saying, the Fed leans to the view that they're not at the terminal rate, that inflation is coming down because they're raising rates. They have not achieved the terminal rate. So my expectation is the Fed will raise interest rates 25 basis points in March. March 22nd is the Fed meeting after that. That'll get you to 5.25. And even the more hawkish members think that that's probably the terminal rate. So Powell and the Fed have said, yeah, inflation's coming down, but it's because we're raising rates, not because we're at the terminal rate. We're going to get to the terminal rate, probably 2 more hikes, and then we'll pause. And then if we're right, we'll just let inflation come down on its own. And that may take a year. So all this stuff about the Fed pivot and cutting rates and all that stuff, I mean, the Fed's thinking mid-2024 before they do that. Now, Wall Street, and I'll say markets, not just Wall Street, but the big money in places like the Eurodollar futures curve and the U.S. Treasury curve, which are highly inverted, are saying, no, you're not going to get that far. You may be at the terminal rate already. You're definitely going to cause a recession. It'll be more severe than you think, and rates are going to have to come down sooner than people expect. In other words, you've already achieved the terminal rate. You just don't know it, and you'll probably be the last to know. So with Wall Street, with the cheerleaders, sending that message, but with some serious market indicators, including yield curves, sending that message. Why is Powell sticking to the game plan as I described it? And the answer goes back to 1980, believe it or not, and what's called the Volcker mistake. And everyone knows, Volcker became Fed chairman in 1979. He stayed on until the early to mid 80s. And he did raise interest rates to 20% or very close to it to kill inflation, which went up to 15% at the time. But people forget that there was a recession in 1980. It was sharp but quick. It was over very quickly. It had nothing to do with monetary policy. The Carter administration issued some dopey regulation on a ceiling on credit card interest rates. And the industry said, fine, we're just not going to lend anybody any money. The economy fell instantly, kind of like a smaller version of what happened in 2020 with the pandemic panic. And then they said, oh, sorry, just kidding. And then they took the ceiling off and then things got back to normal. Now, this was a time when farmers around the country were driving front loaders and tractors to Washington, and they were circling the Fed building. And one guy drove his tractor up the steps of the Fed, and Volcker was being burned in effigy. That all happened. So it was a little bit of pressure. And of course, Congress was up in arms and the White House was up in arms. So Volcker, not quite panicked, but he cut interest rates 7 percentage points, not 0.7, 7 full percentage points to deal with the recession, which, number one, was unnecessary because the recession was caused by a policy blunder from the White House, which was quickly corrected. And number two, he had not won the fight against inflation. Well, after he cut rates, and we came out of that very quick sort of snap recession, inflation got even worse. And that's when Volcker had to raise rates to 20%. And Volcker, in hindsight, he said, we shouldn't have done that. We should have stuck to our inflation mission. So now Powell, remember, Powell's not an economist. He's a lawyer. So he kind of thinks like a lawyer. I can relate to that, looking at both sides. Powell does not want to be that guy. He does not want to be the guy who balks early and cuts rates, the famous Wall Street pivot, before the battle against inflation is won, because the outcome could be exactly what Volcker experienced, which is inflation wasn't done, doesn't go away, comes back stronger, and then you do have to destroy the economy, as we did in 1981-82. That was the worst recession. That was far worse than the little one in 1980. That was the worst since the Great Depression. We've managed to break that record several times since then, but at the time that was horrific. But Volcker and others have said that was a blunder. He never should have done. So Powell does not want to give up the rate hikes too early because he does not want to repeat the Volcker mistake. He does not want to be that guy. And that's what's driving him, even as Wall Street screams, you're already there. So the question is, how does this play out? In my view, Powell probably is there. He probably is at something like a terminal rate. He probably doesn't have to raise interest rates anymore. He doesn't believe that himself. His models tell him otherwise because they're relying on the Phillips curve, which is junk science. I mean, the last time I looked at a Phillips curve, it was flat. At least where I went to school, curve was curved. This thing is flat. There is no correlation between unemployment and inflation. There just isn't. But the Fed thinks there is. So I always tell people, if you want to forecast Fed policy and understand the Fed, don't think like a rational person. You have to think like the Fed. You have to get inside their heads or else you're going to get it wrong. So they're looking at unemployment, which is the lowest. The unemployment rate is the lowest since 1969. Well, if you believe in the Phillips curve, then that's a sure sign of inflation. As I say, even though it's coming down, it's still pretty high. They think they have to keep fighting this fight. But here's what they're missing. Here's where it all falls down. Yeah, inflation as measured, CPI, PPI, personal consumption expenditure, core, non-core, year over year. There are like 20 different ways to measure it. It is coming down. But there are two sources of inflation. And it's going to sound obvious, but you got to separate them, the supply side and the demand side. Both result in price increases, but they have completely different dynamics. Supply side inflation is what we're seeing. It's what we saw in 1974 with the Arab oil embargo during the Arab-Israeli war when they cut us off from oil. And, you had to line up for gasoline. I lived through that. Now, and again, this is what my book Sold Out is about, the breakdown of the supply chain, partly related to energy, partly related to the war in Ukraine, partly related to the pandemic panic. As I explained in the book, it actually predates that. The breakdown started in 2018 with Trump's trade war. And then COVID made it worse, yes. Ukrainian war made it worse, yes. But it really started before that. So, of course, prices went up and people were trying to pay whatever they had to get what they needed. And energy prices were a big driver of that. So that feeds through as a form of inflation. The other kind of inflation is from the demand side. So the supply side is called cost push. Costs go up and they push it onto the consumers. The other kind is from the demand side. It's called demand pull. And basically consumers have a change in mentality. They're worried about inflation. They would say, hey, I was thinking about buying a refrigerator. Gee, I better go buy it today because if I wait for 6 months, the price is going to go up. Or apply that to anything, a new dress, new suit of clothes, whatever. And so you're pulling demand forward and it's behavioral. And that will also drive prices up. But they're very different things. Now, cost push can morph into demand pull. That's what happened in the 70s. It started from the supply side, but by the late 70s, 80s, and Volcker, which we've just been talking about, it had tipped over into the demand side. That hasn't happened yet. We've had the supply side inflation, the cost push. It hasn't yet tipped into demand pull. It hasn't really affected consumer behavior that much in terms of people anticipating more inflation. It could, but it hasn't happened yet. Here's why that's an important distinction. Cost push inflation negates itself. The old saying that the cure for high oil prices is high oil prices. So it tends to negate itself, whereas demand pull feeds on itself. Powell has not made that distinction. And if I'm right, I think I am right, and the evidence backs that up, this inflation will come down, not because the Fed is raising interest rates, but because higher prices destroy demand all on their own. So it does tend to depress demand, destroy demand, and hurt the economy. Russia had about 600 tons of gold, and today they have 2,300 tons. China had about 600 tons of gold, and today they have about 2,000 tons, just slightly less, that we know of. And they may have several thousand tons off the books in the State Administration of Foreign Exchange that we don't know about because that's completely opaque. So Russia and China did exactly what we warned the Pentagon about in 2009, exactly, which is increase their gold reserves by a factor of 4 or more. When you talk about reserve currency, you have to understand what that means. It's not like the People's Bank of China has a bunch of $100 bills on pallets stacked up in the basement. When people say reserve currency, what they really mean is the currency of the bonds that they invest in. In other words, they're dollar-denominated assets in the form of treasury bonds or notes. That's what China actually has on their books, not like dollars per se. What I was hypothesizing then, and I'll come back to this, is you can create a brand new currency that does have all that stuff. And in my example, they used a Swiss bank, UK law, put the gold in a third-party depository. If you wanted some of the new currency, you could deposit your own gold and get some of the currency or trade with them or run a surplus. So it was a replacement system, but you would need the gold to instill confidence. But they don't have bond markets, so they're not going to have them soon. So the yuan and the ruble aren't going to replace anything. Well, the repercussions may be felt for 10 years or longer, but the immediate impact is going to go well beyond the so-called sanctions. What the point I was really making was we're slapping sanctions on Russia. Russia is hitting back with some retaliatory actions, and it's pretty easy to look at the direct impact of that, but there's second-order and third-order effects that will pop up all over the world and could very quickly get out of control. Think of it as the economic equivalent of a nuclear war. Nobody wants a nuclear war. But the one thing they all said in common, the one thing they all shared was, don't go there. And what they meant was that nobody wakes up and says, oh, gee, I think I'll start a nuclear war today. What a good idea. That never happens. What does happen is you get into an escalatory situation, back and forth, where you're escalating, and you end up in a nuclear war. You never intended it, never started out that way. but you end up there through escalation. Now take that, and that is good analysis. Take that and apply it to what is now, I would say, the first full-scale economic war, sanctions war. We've had sanctions, for a long time, and going back to at least the 70s with Iran, but even before that, FDR put sanctions on Japan. Nothing on this scale. This is unprecedented in its scope and application. And my only point is the effects of this are going to not just last a long time, yes, but they're going to pop up in very, very unexpected places. I did. Let me make the point. There was never a war that was easier to prevent. There's never been a war that's easier to prevent, and there's never been a war that's easier to end. You could end this war in 48 hours or less. Having said that, I did expect that through a series of policy blunders and escalation, in this case, military escalation and political escalation, and then later in the book, around on page 250 or so, I have a whole section on Ukraine, Russia, and natural gas. So this has been brewing for a long time. You can go back to the 2008 Bucharest Declaration, but if you wanted to pick one thing and say, hey, when did this thing take a turn for the worse?
Right. So
that we were on a path to war. That was the color revolution sponsored by Obama and Biden, which was a coup d'etat. The president of Ukraine at the time, he was pro-Russian, and Obama set out to depose him, and they did. And they put in Poroshenko, who was a U.S. puppet, and at the same time, 2 months after the color revolution, 1 month before Poroshenko, Putin took Crimea. He said, okay, that's how you want to play, fine. You move away from neutrality, move towards NATO, I'll take Crimea, your move. And then there was nothing, Putin didn't take one square inch during the Trump administration, because Trump is highly unpredictable, but put Biden back in, who was part of the original Obama-Biden team. And so not only was Trump not in Putin's pocket, he was the only one who stood up to Putin in such a way that Putin didn't take one square inch of territory. He took Crimea under Obama. Now he's taking kind of half the country under Biden. Didn't take anything under Trump. So that completely debunks that. But just to take it one step further, who is in the pocket of the Ukrainians, at least? And the answer is Joe Biden, because of Hunter Biden, who made millions of dollars from Burisma, their large natural gas company. Ukraine is ranked in the low 90s of the most corrupt countries in the world. In other words, it's at the bottom on a corruption list with the most honest countries being on top. Ukraine is very close to the bottom. It's the most corrupt country in Europe, one of the most corrupt countries in the world. Zelensky is just another oligarch, just another phony. Now, you can take sides, but to me, Putin's a dictator, Zelensky's a dictator. Pick your dictator. But this idea that he's some good guy Democrat is nonsense. Well, it's a phone call, basically. Biden's kind of non-compos mentis, but somebody who can string a few sentences together needs to call Zelensky and say, here's what we're going to do. You're not going to join NATO. We'll get the NATO Secretary General, John Stoltenberg, to say that. You need to say it, and the U.S. will say it. So you're not going to join NATO. You're not going to join the EU. You can be independent in the sense of being autonomous, but you have to be neutral. When you've got two great powers, whether it's the U.S. and Russia, or the U.S. plus Europe and Russia confronting each other, the idea of buffer states, that's as old as, if not history, at least the history of buffer states is several centuries old at this point. It's a part of what every international strategist looks at. So Ukraine should be a buffer state. It should be neutral. That way Putin has no reason to invade, and we have no reason to try to push the borders of NATO to a point slightly east of Moscow, which Moscow hasn't been attacked from the east since Genghis Khan. These sanctions will not work to stop the war or slow the war or change the outcome of the war. Now, they absolutely punish the Russian economy. Yep. They punish Russian individuals, consumers, Russian citizens. They're going to have fewer options, more expensive goods. Their economy is going to slow down. Unemployment will go up. The ruble is devalued. All those things are true. But they're also true in the United States. We're going to punish Americans far worse than the Russians. We're already seeing. I took a long trip yesterday. I filled up my car with gas at the end of the trip. It was $76. Inflation's here. We all see it. Price of gasoline, eggs, milk, butter, groceries at the store, rents, electricity, home heating, fuel, you name it, across the board, inflation's affecting everything. And it started really in mid-2021, so here we are, almost 2023, so that's been going on for well over a year. For the first 6 or 7 months, Jay Powell, and for that matter, Janet Yellen, were like, yeah, we see it, but it's transitory. We know that story. Finally, in November 2021, Jay Powell threw in the towel, said, okay, time to retire the word transitory. Now let's get to work. And they started raising interest rates in March 2022. And we're now up to Fed funds rate of 4%. They're going to raise them again in December 14th by another 50 basis points. We kind of, still a little bit away from that, but we know it's coming. The Fed, this is the no drama Fed. They tell you what they're doing in advance. So I always say you don't need a crystal ball to figure out the Fed. You just need to listen to what they're saying and believe them. So they're going to do 50 basis points in December. That'll get the policy rate of the Fed funds target rate to 4.5%. But that's from zero. March 1st, it was zero. So to go from 0 to 4.5 in less than 9 months, about 8.5 months, that's amazing. We haven't seen anything like that since Paul Volcker in the early 80s. Now, I know rates are not 13, 14%, but to go from 0 to 4.5, I can say in 8 months is a shock. Now, why is the Fed doing this? Well, they say they want to kill inflation. Okay, but there are two sources of inflation. Inflation can come from the supply side, what's called cost push inflation. Costs go up and they get pushed into retail prices and consumer prices, and that is what's happening. That's because of the supply chain breakdown, energy prices, shortages of goods, etc. So that's cost push inflation from the supply side. There's another kind of inflation that comes from the demand side. And this is much more psychological. It's when consumers say, they just have it in their heads and maybe from objective data that prices are going up. And so they change their behavior. They say, I was thinking of getting a new washing machine, but I was going to wait 6 months, but I better buy it now because the price is going to be a lot higher in 6 months. Or a car, suit of clothes, a dress, furniture, whatever it is, better buy it now because the price is going to go up. It's going to get worse. Inflation is here to stay. Commodities are going to boom. Oil prices are going to soar. Bonds are going to crash. And gold has been in a very funny situation, which is the following. Normally, you say, well, if there's inflation coming, why isn't the price of gold going to the moon? And why on earth would gold prices go up if there were deflation or disinflation? The answer is that you have to look at the yield to maturity on the 10-year Treasury note. That's our benchmark security. A lot of people look at LIBOR, but I'm like, no. If you're making investment decisions, you're buying a house, you're doing capital investing, these are all 5, 10, sometimes 20-year decisions. The 10-year note is the right benchmark for those large, long-term investments. Well, that's an alternative place to put money. You can buy gold, you can buy a 10-year Treasury note. So what's been true since last summer is as the yield to maturity on the 10-year note goes up, that strengthens the dollar, and gold prices have gone down because the dollar price of gold is just another cross rate, just another cross exchange rate. So a stronger dollar means a lower dollar price for gold. But if the yield to maturity in the 10-year note goes down, then that weakens the dollar and the dollar price of gold goes up because a weaker dollar means a higher dollar price for gold. So curiously, the price of gold is being driven not by inflation in the abstract, but by the strength of the dollar, which is reciprocal to the interest rate on the 10-year Treasury notes. But here's what has changed. I talk about gold bull markets and gold bear markets, and I start my analysis in 1971, and I don't have to go through all that data, but that's how I think about it. And you're like, well, Jim, why 1971? Why not before that? And of course, 1971, it was when Nixon stopped redeeming dollars for gold. Americans couldn't even own gold in 1971. It was contraband. It was like drugs or machine guns or something. But foreign trading partners could redeem dollars for gold up until 1971. And then Nixon said no more. And then that was the final decoupling. But prior to that, gold was actually money. In other words, under Bretton Woods, gold was pegged at $35 an ounce. Prior to Bretton Woods, it was pegged at $20.67 an ounce. So going back to the 1920s or earlier, through most of the 19th century. for the United States in sterling. I think it was 4.75. It could be off a little bit on that, but four pounds and change. And as late as World War I, say 1913, if you were a Brit and you were getting on the steamer from London to, at the time Bombay, today Mumbai, you took a purse of British sovereigns. British sovereign is about 8 grams, a little bit less. It's not an ounce; it's a quarter ounce, because an ounce is almost too much. Even today, what are you going to do with a 1 ounce coin that's worth almost $2,000? You're not going to use that to buy a pack of gum. But in the day, there was the quarter ounce, which today would be, like a $500 bill. So it's still a significant amount of money. But you could get on the steamer in Southampton and get off in Bombay at the time, and it was money good. You could take that British sovereign and spend it anywhere. And same thing in Singapore and Hong Kong and Japan or all around the world. So gold was actually money. So it wasn't a question of, what's the exchange rate? It was, the gold was the money, and people thought about it by weight. They said, a sovereign, that's 8 grams of gold. So that's worth, that'll get you whatever. So, and that was true throughout history. And so it's really only since 1971, when we decoupled completely in terms of an exchange rate, that you have to think about, what's the dollar price of gold? Because it's not fixed. But okay, well, what happened to the memory? What happened to the 3,000 years I just talked about? Well, the answer is it happened in stages, and it actually took about 75 years. So it began in 1914. 1914 was the outbreak of World War I. Everybody needed gold. There was a run on gold, and countries needed gold because they knew they would need gold to pay for the war, to try to win the war. Well, it didn't matter if you're Germany, UK, or whoever. And remember, the United States was neutral. The United States did not get in the war until 1917. The war started in 1914. So for those first 2.5 years, New York was a money center to all of Europe, to all the belligerents. So everyone scrambled for gold. So if you were a citizen, they asked you to bring your gold to the bank, and they gave you paper money. But people did it out of a patriotic. It's existential. War is not a normal market. If you lose the war, you got bigger problems than your gold. And so people put the gold in the banks. What did the banks do? They melted it down and made 400-ounce bars. And they said, don't worry, your money's backed by the gold, but keep using that paper money, but it's redeemable for gold. But, oh, by the way, they're 400-ounce bars. Nobody walks around with a 400-ounce bar in her purse. I'm sure you've seen one, and I have as well. They're heavy. They weigh about 35 pounds. You don't walk around with them. So all of a sudden, the gold was still there, and the paper money was backed by gold in theory, but the gold had disappeared into the banks. That's step one. Step two, and this happened in the 1930s, the central banks took the gold from the commercial banks. So first, the commercial banks took the gold from the people. Then the central banks took the gold from the commercial banks, and the Federal Reserve System told all the banks, hey, send your gold to the regional Federal Reserve Bank. And of course, most of it went to the Federal Reserve Bank in New York. So now it's not even in the banks anymore, right? But you're still walking around thinking your paper money is somehow attached to gold. But people haven't seen gold for a while, unless you're a collector. Step three, the United States Treasury and the finance ministries took it from the central bank. In 1934, the United States Treasury seized the gold of the Federal Reserve System. Bearing in mind, the Federal Reserve System is privately owned. And they gave them a gold certificate. And you go to the Federal Reserve System website today and, hunt around a little bit on the links and find the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve, and it's there. And look in the assets. And the first line item is gold certificate, and it's valued at $11 billion. But that's because they value the gold at $42 an ounce. And I've revalued it, the answer is that today's market, that $11 billion is actually worth $470 billion. So the Fed has a hidden asset of $450 odd billion that's not on the balance sheet, represented by a gold certificate. But it's not the gold. The Treasury has the gold. And by the way, where do we keep our gold? I'm talking about the United States. The Treasury owns the gold. The Fed has a paper certificate. The gold is on 2 Army bases, West Point and Fort Knox. So I would say the Army has the gold. Gold has gone from citizens walking around having it in your purse, to commercial banks, to central banks, to finance ministries, held on an Army base. It's still there. The gold didn't disappear, but nobody talks about it, and everyone pretends it's not money. But of course it's money. But meanwhile, what's happened to the civilian population, the citizens? We stopped talking about it. We stopped saying it. We stopped learning about it. I remind people, just showing my age, but I got a graduate degree in international economics. and I was class of 74. But that was the year the IMF demonetized gold. But I was the last class that was taught gold in an academic setting as a monetary asset. If you're younger than I am and you know anything about gold, you're either self-taught or you went to mining college, because they just stopped teaching it. So now we have two generations of scholars who never learned a thing about gold. So they hid it, they took it, they buried it, they stopped teaching it, they stopped talking about it, and they pretended it's not there. Meanwhile, it is there. And Russia is a good example of someone who takes it seriously. In the U.S., we still have our 8,000 tons, 8,133 tons. We haven't given it away. We haven't sold any gold since 1980, by the way. We got the British to do it. We got everyone else to do our dirty work. The British sold more than half. No, seriously, the British sold more than half their gold. The Swiss sold 1,000 tons. The IMF sold 400 tons in 2010. That was the last significant sale by a monetary institution. Australia sold most of theirs. Canada sold most of theirs. If I were one of these other countries, I would say to the U.S., hey, why don't you sell some of your gold? But the U.S. doesn't. We haven't sold an ounce since 1980. Inflation is coming down, by the way. And having said that, the target is 2%. So he's not there, but he's making progress. Now, Wall Street's saying, you're done. You did it. Mission accomplished. Inflation is coming down. You got what you wanted. Give it time. Stop raising rates. You're going to kill the economy. But the Fed is saying, well, we actually don't know. We can't untangle it. Yes, inflation is coming down. That's objective. But is it coming down because we're still raising rates? Or is it coming down because we're at the terminal rate? Those are two different things. And right now, and this is what Powell's been saying, the Fed leans to the view that they're not at the terminal rate, that inflation is coming down because they're raising rates. They have not achieved the terminal rate. So Powell and the Fed have said, yeah, inflation is coming down, but it's because we're raising rates, not because we're at the terminal rate. We're going to get to the terminal rate, and then we'll pause. And then if we're right, we'll just let inflation come down on its own. And that may take a year. So all this stuff about the Fed pivot and cutting rates and all that stuff, I mean, the Fed's thinking mid-2024 before they do that. Now, Wall Street, and I'll say markets, not just Wall Street, but the big money in places like the Eurodollar futures curve and the U.S. Treasury curve, which are highly inverted, are saying, no, you're not going to get that far. You may be at the terminal rate already. You're definitely going to cause a recession. It'll be more severe than you think, and rates are going to have to come down sooner than people expect. In other words, you've already achieved the terminal rate. You just don't know it, and you'll probably be the last to know. So with Wall Street, with the cheerleaders, sending that message, but with some serious market indicators, including yield curves, sending that message, why is Powell sticking to the game plan as I described it? And the answer goes back to 1980, believe it or not, and what's called the Volcker mistake. And everyone knows, Volcker became Fed chairman in 1979. He stayed on until the early to mid 80s. And he did raise interest rates to 20% or very close to it to kill inflation, which went up to 15% at the time. But people forget that there was a recession in 1980. It was sharp but quick. It was over very quickly. It had nothing to do with monetary policy. The Carter administration issued some dopey regulation on a ceiling on credit card interest rates. And the industry said, fine, we're just not going to lend anybody any money. The economy fell instantly, kind of like a smaller version of what happened in 2020 with the pandemic panic. And then they said, oh, sorry, just kidding. And then they took the ceiling off, and then things got back to normal. Now, this was a time when farmers around the country were driving front loaders and tractors to Washington, and they were circling the Fed building. And one guy drove his tractor up the steps of the Fed, and Volcker was being burned in effigy. That all happened. So it was a little bit of pressure. And of course, Congress was up in arms and the White House was up in arms. So Volcker, not quite panicked, but he cut interest rates 7 percentage points, not 0.7, 7 full percentage points to deal with the recession, which, number one, was unnecessary because the recession was caused by a policy blunder from the White House, which was quickly corrected. And number two, he had not won the fight against inflation. Well, after he cut rates and we came out of that very quick sort of snap recession, inflation got even worse. And that's when Volcker had to raise rates to 20%. And Volcker, in hindsight, he said, we shouldn't have done that. We should have stuck to our inflation mission. So now Powell, remember, Powell's not an economist, he's a lawyer, so he kind of thinks like a lawyer. I can relate to that, looking at both sides. Powell does not want to be that guy. He does not want to be the guy who balks early and cuts rates, the famous Wall Street pivot, before the battle against inflation is won, because the outcome could be exactly what Volcker experienced, which is inflation wasn't done, doesn't go away, comes back stronger, and then you do have to destroy the economy, as we did in 1981-82. That was the worst recession. That was far worse than the little one in 1980. That was the worst since the Great Depression. We've managed to break that record several times since then, but at the time that was horrific. But Volcker and others have said that was a blunder he never should have done. So Powell does not want to give up the rate hikes too early because he does not want to repeat the Volcker mistake. He does not want to be that guy. And that's what's driving him, even as Wall Street screams, you're already there. So the question is, how does this play out? In my view, Powell probably is there. He probably is at something like a terminal rate. He probably doesn't have to raise interest rates anymore. He doesn't believe that himself. His models tell him otherwise because they're relying on the Phillips curve, which is junk science. I mean, the last time I looked at a Phillips curve, it was flat. At least where I went to school, curve was curved. This thing is flat. There is no correlation between unemployment and inflation. There just isn't. But the Fed thinks there is. So I always tell people, if you want to forecast Fed policy and understand the Fed, don't think like a rational person. You have to think like the Fed. You have to get inside their heads or else you're going to get it wrong. So they're looking at unemployment, which is the lowest. The unemployment rate is the lowest since 1969. Well, if you believe in the Phillips curve, then that's a sure sign of inflation. You know, as I say, even though it's coming down, it's still pretty high. They think they have to keep fighting this fight. But here's what they're missing. Here's where it all falls down. Yeah, inflation as measured, CPI, PPI, personal consumption expenditure, core, non-core, year over year. There are like 20 different ways to measure it. It is coming down, but there are two sources of inflation. And it's going to sound obvious, but you got to separate them, the supply side and the demand side. Both result in price increases, but they have completely different dynamics. Supply side inflation is what we're seeing. It's what we saw in 1974 with the Arab oil embargo during the Arab-Israeli war when they cut us off from oil. And, you had to line up for gasoline. I lived through that. Now, and again, this is what my book Sold Out is about, the breakdown of the supply chain, partly related to energy, partly related to the war in Ukraine, partly related to the pandemic panic. As I explained in the book, it actually predates that. The breakdown started in 2018 with Trump's trade war, and then COVID made it worse, yes. Ukrainian war made it worse, yes. But it really started before that. So, of course, prices went up and people were trying to pay whatever they had to get what they needed, and energy prices were a big driver of that. So that feeds through as a form of inflation. The other kind of inflation is from the demand side. So the supply side is called cost push. Costs go up and they push it onto the consumers. The other kind is from the demand side. It's called demand pull. And basically consumers have a change in mentality. They're worried about inflation. They would say, hey, I was thinking about buying a refrigerator. Gee, I better go buy it today because if I wait for 6 months, the price is going to go up. Or apply that to anything, a new dress, new suit of clothes, whatever. And so you're pulling demand forward and it's behavioral. And that will also drive prices up. But they're very different things. Now, cost push can morph into demand pull. That's what happened in the 70s. It started from the supply side, but by the late 70s, 80s, and Volcker, which we've just been talking about, it had tipped over into the demand side. That hasn't happened yet. We've had the supply side inflation, the cost push. It hasn't yet tipped into demand pull. It hasn't really affected consumer behavior that much in terms of people anticipating more inflation. It could, but it hasn't happened yet. Here's why that's an important distinction. Cost push inflation negates itself. The old saying that the cure for high oil prices is high oil prices. So it tends to negate itself, whereas demand pull feeds on itself. Powell has not made that distinction. And if I'm right, I think I am right, and the evidence backs that up, this inflation will come down, not because the Fed is raising interest rates, but because higher prices destroy demand all on their own. So it does tend to depress demand, destroy demand, and hurt the economy. And then it slows down, and then the inflation comes down on its own. That appears to be happening. But Powell hasn't really made the distinction. He's fighting the last war. I hate to use a cliche, but he's fighting the Volcker war. Powell doesn't want to repeat the Volcker mistake. He thinks the battle's not won. He has to get to the terminal rate. In reality, he's probably already there. The future is very positive for gold. You have the normal vectors. Supply is flat has been for 6 years. Demand is going up. Central banks have flipped from net sellers to net buyers. That's a big deal. Kind of retail and institutional interest is higher, so that's good. Geopolitical threats, don't need to say a lot. From the U.S. perspective, Iran, China, North Korea, Venezuela, Russia, you name it. So that's the vector. But the biggest driver right now is what I referred to a few minutes ago: negative real rates. Because gold, as a form of money, which is how I view it, competes with other competes with other instruments, treasury bills, etc. Well, if they have high yields and gold has no yield, you want the treasury bills. But if interest rates have negative yields and gold's just flat, gold looks more attractive. So that's the main driver, and that's going to continue. Everyone's like, well, the gold is up, gold is down. So what do you mean when you say that? And they're talking about the dollar price of gold. And it's like, okay, so the dollar price of gold is up or down. That's really a cross rate. That's no different than talking about the euro US dollar exchange rate or Australian dollar US dollar exchange rate. If you think of gold as money, and I do, then the dollar price of gold, with gold measured by weight, not as another currency, it is another form of money, but with gold measured by weight, it's a cross exchange rate. When the price goes up, I would say that what's really happening is the dollar is going down. In other words, I think of gold by weight. I'm interested, do you have a ton? Do you have 50 kilos? Do you have 5 ounces? Whatever you have as an individual investor, as a bank, I think of it by weight. Because when someone says gold's really going up, I said, well, no, the dollar's going down. You need more dollars to purchase a fixed quantity of gold, which means the dollar's worth less. And when people say gold's really going down, I say, no, the dollar's worth more, and you need fewer dollars to purchase a quantity of gold. In other words, when people talk about price, the first thing they do is they're really talking about dollars. There's a euro price for gold, but the world market is based on dollars. You're privileging the dollar as the numeraire. The numeraire is your counting system. Is it yards, inches, feet, whatever? And if you put the dollar first and say gold is in dollars and it's going up or down, I think you have it backwards. I think you need to put gold first by weight, and then if it's worth more, the dollar's going down. If it's worth less, the dollar's going up. And so when you say gold is going up, let's say it went to $2,000 an ounce, everyone say, oh, the price of gold went up, just went up 10%. Well, did it, or did the dollar go down? The way I would phrase it is, it used to be $1,800 to get an ounce of gold. Now it's $2,000 to get an ounce of gold, or, your dollar got you 1/1800th of an ounce. Today, it only gets you 1/2000th of an ounce. In other words, gold didn't do anything. It's a metal, it's an element, atomic number 79. What happened was the dollar got stronger. So a stronger dollar is a lower dollar price for gold, and a weaker dollar is a higher dollar price for gold. So when people talk about gold going up, what they're really talking about is the dollar going down.
We have new numbers regarding how much gold central banks are buying, 400 tons in Q3 this year, records and numbers we haven't seen since the 80s. Yet we don't know some of those mystery buyers. Obviously, the theories are they are Russia and China.
Now China's non-transparent. Russia is much more transparent, although Russia is starting to be opaque a little bit because they're in a war. But you can see the inflection point is 2010. So from 1970 to 2010, it's a long stretch, 40 years, central banks were net sellers. It didn't mean everybody sold everything, but Switzerland's down 1,000 tons, U.S. was down 1,000 tons after losing 8,000 tons, or sorry, 11,000 tons between 1950 and 1970. It was down, down, down. 2010 was the year that central banks became net buyers. Now, it doesn't mean every central bank was buying gold. It does mean that they were selling a lot less and others were buying more. And some of the buyers are Mexico, Kazakhstan, Philippines, Vietnam. We know China's a big buyer. We don't know exactly how much. Russia was a big buyer. That is continuing. Now the new players, Iran's non-transparent, but we know they're buying gold. Turkey is buying a lot of gold. Japan had a bunch of gold all along. They never told anybody about. Literally in 1 month, their reserves went from 600 tons to 900 tons. Well, you know the market. You can't buy 300 tons in a month, not one country in one order. But they had it all along, but they decided to reveal it, put it on their balance sheet. So Americans don't seem to like gold. I'm not sure Canadians feel much differently, or others around the world. But central banks sure do, and I think that tells you something. There's huge demand for dollars all over the world, not because of the currency, but because of collateral, because of treasury bills. Banks need treasury bills to pledge as collateral for derivatives. It's the best collateral in the world. And if you don't have it, you're not going to be able to leverage your balance sheet as much as you would like. You're not going to be as profitable. You're not going to be able to support lending and investing, which is what banks in theory are supposed to do. To support the bloated balance sheets and to support the derivatives, you need collateral. And the better the collateral, the more leverage you can have. The best collateral in the world is a treasury bill. And so there's a mad scramble for treasury bills, which means there's a mad scramble for dollars to buy treasury bills. And that is coming from European banks, it's coming from Chinese banks, and banks around the world, but primarily European and Chinese. And that's not going away. So it's funny to hear people think it's funny to hear anyone talk about a dollar collateral shortage, like, hey, haven't you flooded the world with dollars? Hasn't the Fed printed $9 trillion? And the answer is they have. But that's not the measure. It's a high multiple of that. It's the dollar value of all the collateral. Because in the repo markets, I pledge the collateral to you, and then you pledge it to somebody else, one of our colleagues, and then she pledges it to somebody else, et cetera. That collateral gets pledged 50 times and supports not $1 a balance sheet, but $50 a balance sheet for $1 of collateral. And so you restrict the collateral, you're restricting the balance sheet. The dollar as a reserve currency will not be deposed overnight, but as a payment currency, there's a difference between a reserve currency and a payment currency. Anything can be a payment currency. If I want to pay you with baseball cards and bottle caps and you're okay with that, then it's a currency. So all of these organizations are working on new payment systems right now, and they're going to start to roll them out this year and later. So that's going to be a radical change in how we pay for things. I can give you 20 reasons why the dollar should go down, but I'll give you one big reason why it won't, which is the demand for collateral. And so that's keeping the dollar constant, which is keeping the dollar price of gold constant, because gold doesn't change and the dollar's not changing. Now that'll break, and that'll break in favor of gold, meaning the dollar will get a lot weaker. It'll have to, but it's going to take a few months at least, because the U.S. economy has to get weaker, which it is. The Fed will figure this out maybe by September, next September. And then they'll ease a little bit and they'll try to weaken the dollar to try to give the U.S. economy a boost. But we're not there yet. So it's going to be, now that doesn't mean the price of gold is going down a lot. I'm just saying it's not going to go up a lot. It's going to chug along kind of sideways. But when it breaks, it's going to break big to the upside, because the dollar is going to go to the downside. But that's probably at least still a few months away, maybe longer.